Okay, so we're on to Chapter 5 of Part 2 of Lords of the Press by George Seldes from 1938. And this is going to be our last installment. There is one more short section after this, a Part 3, in which the author, George Seldes, outlines what it would take, the kinds of things that would have to happen in order for the nation to have a truly free and objective press. But those things have never happened. They're never going to happen, so I'm not going to concern ourselves with false hopes here. Okay, so this is going to be the last installment. Chapter 5 of Part 2, 1936 and the Columnists. 1936 is one of the great dates in our political history because it is also a social and economic date. Its significance will undoubtedly grow. Journalistically, it marked the most important repudiation of the press by the public. How important that repudiation was, only time can tell, but it was certainly the first time in our history that a large number of people became aware of the newspaper as a political force, a fact which even the humble European peasant has known for at least a century. 1936 also showed up the place of that new power in American journalism, the columnist. The Washington correspondents, those several hundred men who write the politics of the nation, were overwhelmingly on the side of Roosevelt and reform, although overwhelmingly their papers were opposed. Most of the columnists, however, had no compromise to face, no conscience to trouble them. They, as well as big business, the millionaire oil man of Kansas, Hearst, the Manufacturers Association, the Liberty League, were all on the same side. The Washington correspondents voted 19-1 for Roosevelt. In the Chicago Tribune, New York Herald Tribune, and other towers of Landonism, the vote among the working reporters was about the same ratio. When politics cooled in 1937, the editorial board of the New Republic prepared a study of the press and the public, which said that among the debris scattered across 48 states on the morning of November 5th, 1936, quote, were the microphone of Father Coughlin, the silk hats of the Liberty League, the high stiff collar of Dr. Townsend, and, like the accumulation of wreckage left by the recession of every flood, the power of the press. Some of the country's foremost columnists were included in the repudiation of the press, unquote. The general press repudiation, the circulation figures, the number of newspapers, and other statistical tests of the repudiation of 1936 do not tell the whole story. Editor and publisher, for example, tries to make out a case for its friends, the membership of the ANPA, from the fact that 1935 circulation figures were used by the liberal journals in estimating the readership of 1936. I do not think it necessary to quibble. The fact is that if the press was not 9-1 against Roosevelt, it was 7-3 or 6-4 against him, and that in 1938 this percentage increased still more. And the reason, as Captain Patterson of the New York Daily News so bluntly said, had more to do with pocketbooks than principles. The fair, impartial Christian Century, without using statistics, said that thousands, probably millions, of the ballots cast in the 1936 elections were not merely for Roosevelt, but votes against the newspapers in general. Quote, Election Day, 1936, was Judgment Day for America's daily press, unquote. Unfair, partial apologists for the publishers have listed the papers in the solid South, with their millions of readers, without explaining that no opposition press existed there and no contest. On the other hand, the anti-press case would be made much worse by testing the specific gravity of the papers officially listed as pro-Roosevelt. In New York City, for instance, the Post, the World Telegram, the Times, and the News, with more than 2.5 million circulation, are listed as supporting Roosevelt, against 2.25 million for Landon in the Hearst Press, the Herald Tribune, and the Sun. A rather fair setup, but one must not rest on figures. One must attempt to measure emotions. The passion which Hearst put into his pro-Landon campaign was a combination of all the yellowness which has made him notorious for half a century and earned him the boycott of most decent and intelligent people in America at long last. As Dr. Beard recently pointed out, there was no cesspool which Mr. Hearst has not searched, no art of character assassination which he has not practiced. And so, stories were invented, headlines were colored, news was puffed up or suppressed, and everything possible done to smear and destroy the reformer in the White House. The Sun refrained from yellowness. It ran no gargantuan headlines, invented no pure fakes, kept out of cesspools, but it showed that in a nice, gentlemanly, well-bred, upper-class and aristocratic manner, it was able to join hands with Hearst in coloring and distorting and smearing. If Hearst journalism reeked of the sewer, the Sun's smelled of a royal charnel house. The Herald Tribune gave its usually biased Republican news. All in all, the pro-Landon press was strong in its support and extremely active in its propagandizing of the electorate. The 2,296,050 circulation of the four papers was thoroughly exploited by partisan news and editorials, with little attempt made at objectivity except in the Herald Tribune. But the same cannot be said for the pro-Roosevelt press. The Times published one editorial announcing itself for the president, and then continued its policy of presenting the news impartially as between Roosevelt and Landon. Its editorials were never alarming or decisive. Its editorial policy did not affect the news. The World Telegram supported Roosevelt, but it was not with any magnificent enthusiasm. Its support was not very strong. It did not color the news, suppress or distort, or indulge in the usual tricks of the rival pro-Landon press. The news was strongly pro-Roosevelt. This support was important. But the news was broad-minded enough to inaugurate a quote-unquote battle page in which the Republican and Democratic parties would tell their stories, deride the claims of rivals, put over the worst sort of propaganda. The Republicans made great use of this page in the Democratic news. The Post was 100% for Roosevelt. If, therefore, an attempt is made to gauge the quality as well as the quantity of circulation, it will be found that the Landon support was actually more intense than the cold figures indicate, and that a considerable proportion of the Roosevelt figures cannot be rightly placed in his column. In other words, the 71% pro-Landon circulation in what the New Republic called the 15 competitive areas where both candidates had a chance of winning, is actually opposed by less than the 29% pro-Roosevelt circulation of the statistics. Curiously enough, in 4 large cities where the president had not one newspaper on his side, he won by about 2 to 1. In Chicago, where the circulation was almost 10 to 1 for Landon, and that favorite son Knox, the voting was just under 2 to 1 for the quote-unquote outside agitator. Apologists for the press are still interpreting the 1936 figures in an attempt to restore prestige out of debris. But even they admit that the majority of the papers, the circulation, the editorials, and the bias were on Landon's side, and that Landon was defeated by just about an inverse ratio. Columns of strength. The president himself has made the distinction between the Washington correspondents and the Washington columnists. Quote, "I consider it an interesting fact," unquote, wrote Franklin D. Roosevelt in the introduction of his state papers. Quote, "that in spite of this array of editorial opposition, which apparently has been unable to exercise adequate influence upon public opinion in the United States, the majority of newspaper correspondents who cover the White House are personally friendly to the administration, and in general approve its objectives, most of its methods, and the legislation adopted to accomplish its goal. I know that a number of the newspaper correspondents who write so-called unfriendly articles are not personally opposed to the things they write about. I think that the first part of this anomaly can be explained by the fact that many hostile newspaper owners require their Washington correspondents to give their news dispatches a critical or unfriendly touch. The writers of news stories are in a different class from columnists and writers of business newsletters. In recent years, the writers of these latter groups have found a ready market. In most cases, their columns are based either on the pure imagination and invention of the writer, or untrue gossip, which, of course, can be obtained almost for the asking to fit any objective. These pseudo-news services do little real harm, however, and are generally praised as having little value, so far as really affecting public opinion is concerned. With this general estimate, bona fide newspaper reporters and correspondents agree, unquote. I wish I could, says George Seldes. The Gallup poll, Fortune, Margaret Marshall in The Nation, the Christian Science Monitor, and other tests of the popularity and power of the columnists have, it is true, shown that their circulation, which runs from 500,000 to 12 million, is not a real test of their readership and their influence. Nevertheless, it is generally agreed that their power increases at a time the editorial page influence decreases, and that people have more faith in columnists than in most molders of public opinion. They are still gaining followers, whereas the newspapers themselves are more and more forsaken as leaders. The two columnists with the largest following, respectively, Arthur Brisbane and O.O. McIntyre, have died since most of the tests of influence and popularity have been taken. The first was a renegade liberal weakling who parroted Mr. Hearst's stupidities in a stupid way for many years, and did not have much political influence, while the second was merely a small-town boy agape in a big world about which he knew nothing of any significance. The third-ranking popular columnist is Walter Winchell, who for years grew wealthy and famous by reporting the gossip of the great and the faux great, and who lately has joined with many others who are forsaking their glass houses and ivory towers. To the spectacle of the majority of columnists growing more fog-bound daily, we have the heartening sight of the prince of trivialities becoming the chronicler of significant trends. Walter Winchell suddenly has become a ray of hope in the artificial fogs so many of his fellow columnists themselves create. Fourth is Westbrook Pegler. He is a wayward youth, lost in a no-man's land, between the entrenched interests and the general welfare, playing with matches and occasionally touching off great big bombs. When the bombs fall in the enemy camp, as the one in which he preferred to see General Franco in hell rather than in church, he is then magnificent, but you cannot tell whether or not the next grenade will fall at your own feet and lacerate one of your own convictions. Fifth in Fortune's popularity ranking was Dorothy Dix, a woman's page writer, and sixth was Lippmann. One of the excellent results of the Roosevelt-Landon campaign was the self-withdrawal of Walter Lippmann from the field of liberal and progressive journalism. He had already been expelled from the minds of all liberal and progressive intelligent persons, but still maintained a considerable following among the unintelligent who believed themselves liberal and progressive. Mr. Lippmann's declaration for Landon, followed by many weeks of his usual brilliant but meaningless production of hundreds of thousands of words straddling the issue, was a complete betrayal of a man using words to camouflage a compromising mind. The prophet of the Harvard Liberal Club had become the prophet of the Union League Club. Friends who know David Lawrence intimately describe in detail his years of wrestling with the devil, all during which he was able to keep an eye on the source of butter for his bread. Employees of the United States News, the time Mr. Lawrence ran it as a daily, vouch for the publisher's sincere liberalism. More recently, Mr. Lawrence has become another of the majority of columnists who are merely Plutogogues. Mr. Lawrence, moreover, has been able to combine plutocracy with nonsense. Thus, during the 1936 campaign, he was able to predict that the tide had turned against the New Deal on September 8th, when he interpreted a reduced majority for the president, and 2 days later, he found a counter-revolution going on. The very next day, he had a blast against federal spending, and 1 day later he discovered that the New Deal machine, which he called a quote-unquote political racket, had grown to such amazing proportions that he found it, quote, hard to believe unless one examines the situation firsthand, unquote. It went on like that until November 1936, and it still goes on like that. In the 1936 campaign, Haywood Broun, with 42 papers, a large number of them Scripps Howard, and J. Franklin with 47, were the leading supporters of the president. Their combined circulation was small compared to the columnists who wrote anti-Roosevelt stuff. The 5 Landon stars were Mark Sullivan, Lippmann, Lawrence, Alice Longworth, and Frank Kent. 3 who were generally critical of Roosevelt, although not going the whole Landon hog, were Brisbane, Paul Mallon, and Miss Dorothy Thompson. Broun himself is not a Roosevelt man, it being a lesser of two evils choice for him, and this leaves exactly one Roosevelt man among the most popular columnists whose favored candidate was so thoroughly defeated by the newspaper readers of the nation. The Washington merry-go-round was not included in the survey because it is primarily a news, not an editorial column taking political sides. In many respects, however, Drew Pearson and Robert Allen are the fairest and most important political writers. They have not hesitated to give names, dates, and places, even when it meant endangering their sources of information and violating the taboos of religious and secular pressure organizations. Allen and Pearson exposed the pro-fascists in our State Department and their intrigue to keep the embargo on munitions for the Spanish Republic. They named our fascists, and they told of the, you guessed it, Catholic Church lobby in Washington. They have been as free and honest in telling of big business lobbies and pressures, and have never written either pro-Republican or pro-Democratic propaganda, something which cannot be said for the majority of columnists. They are the iconoclasts of Washington. During the 1936 campaign, a slip by the Republican publicity director, Theodore A. Huntley, put 4 pro-Republican columnists on the spot. Huntley had written to Republican editors offering assorted Republican propaganda, adding, quote, "We have thought of a daily or weekly political letter out of Washington, and could arrange for this if there were a sufficient demand for it. Most of you, however, undoubtedly will prefer to run the letters of Mark Sullivan, Dave Lawrence, Frank Kent, Paul Mallon, or other syndicate writers available to you through the regular services," unquote. Charles Michelson, Democratic Party publicity director and former Washington political expert for the New York World, saw this letter and blew up righteously. He answered with a broadside, quote, "The Republican National Committee has formally taken over the 3 musketeers of anti-administration, Frank Kent, Mark Sullivan, and David Lawrence," unquote, Michelson thundered. Parenthesis. Mr. Mallon's name was not included in parentheses. Quote, "Now, I don't know that the Republican organization had the permission of these eminent and talented gentlemen in presenting them as the authors of campaign material. In fact, I have received intimations that they considered the Democratic organization was being unfair in listing them as Republican propagandists. The recent announcement, however, directed to all editors, makes it perfectly plain that the GOP strategists consider them as valiant and unalienable enemies, for the minority party would hardly suggest to the GOP press that they should publish articles that voiced anything other than GOP views. There may be an ethical question involved, for either the Republican organization has justification for its listing these writers as elements of their publicity campaign, in which case, of course, it is hardly ingenuous for the writers to continue to pose as non-partisan observers, merely conveying information to the public, or it had no license to so list them and consequently did them a considerable disservice in conveying to editors that their work was Republican propaganda," unquote. But, lest the reader think the 3 have not been aiding the Republican Party while posing as non-partisans, Michelson piles on extracts of Sullivan and Kent columns to prove his contentions. Post-1936 columnists. After 1936, publishers and columnists, with the exception of Mr. Hearst, who immediately after his private debacle likened Roosevelt to Jackson and changed his antagonistic tune, attacked the President and all his deeds. It is now generally accepted that the fight against the reorganization bill, a measure first proposed in Republican times, was not a fight on a principle, but a fight against a personality. Everyone knows the reform is needed and will come in time. A survey of the press made by the Christian Science Monitor in 1937 proves that while the Gallup and other polls show that the president is still about holding his popularity, there is a decided swing in the press against him. Of that small percentage left which did not previously oppose him, the majority now does. The Monitor survey shows, 1. More than two-thirds of the responding newspapers which supported the president for re-election do not support him on the Supreme Court issue. 2. More than half of the newspapers that have deserted the president on this issue are openly and vigorously opposed to the plan. Others are critical to the plan, seeking a better method for enlarging federal powers. 3. Of the 75 newspapers included in the survey, 19 support the Supreme Court proposal, 52 are opposed either to the whole project or to the method, and 4 remain non-committal for the present. 4. The pro-administration papers supporting the president on this issue have a total circulation, according to Ayer's directory, of 3,136,198. The pro-administration papers opposing the plan have a total circulation of 13,191,693. In the view of La Follette's Progressive, the columnists are largely to blame for the continuation of the fight on Roosevelt reforms. Declaring that in 1936, editors of 85% of the northern newspapers, quote, forgot ethics, logic, sanity, and even good taste, unquote. And in their quote-unquote frothings at the New Deal and liberalism, editor Evju writes that, quote, today, another wrecking crew of journalists has crowded into the spotlight to outdo the reactionary editors for the national title of champion beraters. They are the syndicated columnists on the side of the Tories, most of them owing their present prosperity to their tie-up with some big reactionary paper like the New York Herald Tribune. Of the top-flight columnists assailing Mr. Roosevelt and virtually everything progressive and forward-looking in his administration, almost all are being presented to the public as being liberals. But the type of daily columns these writers grind out long ago destroyed any claims to liberalism they may have had. All are now tub-thumping in the same beat as the most rabid editorial spokesman for our financial and industrial Mr. Biggs. What better proof of this could be offered than a pamphlet which has just been issued by the National Association of Manufacturers and distributed far and wide throughout the country? The pamphlet is a collection of columns written by Miss Thompson, Messrs. Hugh Johnson, Frank Kent, David Lawrence, Walter Lippmann, and Westbrook Pigler. The label of the National Association of Manufacturers on a collection of columns by these writers ought to be enough to convince most people of the utter hypocrisy of any claims of liberalism that are made for them by their sponsors. If they had been kissed en masse by the Liberty League, as they have frequently been kissed individually and privately, their sham and pretense of being liberal could not have been more thoroughly exposed. Unquote. All one had to do is pick out any measure or idea which any liberal editor organization or individual approves, and it will most certainly be attacked by the core of ex-liberal columnists, the most noted of whom are the subject of the succeeding chapter. There was a time when liberals spoke for public ownership of the railroads and the public utilities. But today, the utilities republish the friendly views of the columnists. Messrs. Lippmann and Sullivan and Miss Thompson united in demanding that the President make peace with the utilities. Peace at almost any price. Of course, a soapbox orator in Union Square, parentheses, and I am not attacking him because I have heard sounder economic wisdom expounded there in the drawing rooms of some of our columnists and their bank director economist friends, end parenthesis, might shout that the columnists are merely upholding the ubiquitous capitalist system because their papers were involved with the utilities, parenthesis, which of course is most true, end parenthesis. Or that the writers were holders of interests in the utilities, parenthesis, about which neither he nor I can know anything, although a suspicion at least is warranted, end parenthesis. Or finally, that it is merely the expression of persons who are part and parcel of the same ruling class in America whose interests are identical. The third indictment, of course, is the most valid. It is the one the columnists will most violently deny, because none feels nor believes that such a thing is possible, and that, in his or her intelligent and rational mind, all these views, which the rest of the intelligent and rational world calls reactionary, are the epitome of reason, intelligence, liberalism, and forthright wisdom. Mr. Lippmann and Miss Thompson offer a good laboratory case. Chapter 6 of Part 2. From Reds to Riches, Walter Lippmann. Walter Lippmann rarely criticizes his fellow columnists and rarely, if ever, answers his critics. Like great newspapers themselves, and the Pope only on the occasion when he is speaking ex cathedra on matters of doctrine, and that only since about 1870, Mr. Lippmann maintains a pose of infallibility. But because he began life as a socialist, a wealthy playboy socialist perhaps, but nevertheless active enough to go into politics for a while, and because today he uses his enormous talents, he is supposed to be the most lucid writer in America, in favor of just those very objectives which the socialist system would destroy, his enemies generally speak of him as a renegade. Perhaps the most brutal words ever written against Walter Lippmann was his biography in the pro-big business weekly Time. Quote, "From Socialism to GOP, from New Republic to Herald Tribune, transitions which the contemners of Walter Lippmann today cannot forgive and will not allow to be forgotten. Although his sincerity is about cavil, they question whether the lucidity of his writing is more than a meretricious semblance hiding a confused mind. Sharpest dig at Walter Lippmann was made by Mabel Dodge Luhan, whose Manhattan salon Lippmann frequented as a young man. Walter is never going to lose an eye in a fight. Whatever Walter Lippmann may have lost, it is a fact that he has gained a great deal of this world's goods, has a more than comfortable income, $54,329, 3 houses in Manhattan, Florida, and Wading River, Long Island. Even by the standards of U.S. success, Walter Lippmann does not lead an underprivileged life. Afternoons he rides, fishes, plays golf, fairly, tennis, better, or referees a polo game for his Long Island friends. In the private matter of personal friends, he is more apt to be on intimate terms with Morgan partners than with union leaders. All these things provide grounds for those who question whether he has any title to be called liberal, unquote. No, but he's entitled to be called a Fabian socialist, or the American version of it, I know that. The liberal criticism is well represented in The Nation's editor, Margaret Marshall, who writes that Lippmann, a man, quote, born 50 years too late in the wrong country, unquote, quote, has moved steadily to the right. His prestige and prosperity have increased concomitantly. There is a temptation to dismiss him, in an old phrase, as a man who began with a wealth of thought and ended with a thought of wealth. But the Lippmann processes suggest a multiple and more subtle diagnosis. It is a truism that the effective apologist, like the cruder type of demagogue, must be himself at least half deceived, unquote. Lippmann, she adds, quote, removes himself from the battlefield and yet maintains his claim to liberalism. In the writing itself, there is a lack of tension and a pompous, measured elegance that match the profound irrelevance of his much advertised point of view. He recently called Anthony Eden the knight with the wooden sword. It's a perfect description of Lippmann as social thinker. His role as an apologist for the status quo is another matter, unquote. Lippmann's column, headed Today and Tomorrow, Miss Marshall concludes, offers his readers, quote, the triple appeal of snobism, escape, and justification of things as they are. His claim of liberalism, especially since it is his most valuable asset, should deceive no one, least of all himself, unquote. On an earlier occasion, the same magazine said that, although Lippmann, quote, may write, as a colleague remarked in the Herald Tribune, like a revolving door, he thinks like a bird dog, unquote. In Haywood Broun's column, he once said that Lippmann, quote, espouses the comforting idea that we are safe in the arms of Morgan, unquote. Broun ridicules Lippmann's views on the free press, quote, does Mr. Lippmann really think, unquote, he asks, that when he bobs up at breakfast in the daily press from Maine to California, that his own fresh minted views are wholly surrounded by other nuggets? Where was he during the general strike in California, the campaign of Upton Sinclair, and the textile strike along the seaboard? Is it not possible that here and there items which he mistakes in his survey for pure gold may turn to be brass checks on closer scrutiny, unquote. In reviewing the latest Lippmann politico-philosophic book, The Good Society, Professor John Dewey wrote, quote, he does his thinking in something like a vacuum, unquote. On Mr. Lippmann's becoming a Republican, and John T. Flynn insists that fact, and not Lippmann's becoming a Landonite, should be recognized, Flynn wrote the Requiescat in Pace for his ex-liberal colleague. He told how Lippmann, quote, a radical leader in Harvard, unquote, began, quote, that long march to the right which has carried him over nearly all the continents of the mind, until he finds himself marching along lustily his face toward the setting sun, with Colonel Knox, Senator Hastings, Senator Dixon, Ogden Mills, the Liberty League, behind the banner of the little oil man from Kansas. As Mr. Lippman marched from left to right, from camp to camp, he neglected to change the flag he carried. He employed the vocabulary of liberalism to support the doctrine of the mortgage note holders. Again, folks, that's because Lippman was the American version of Sidney Webb, approximately. What was it? What was the American socialist? It was called something different. It's something workers. Jack London was the president of it, just the figurehead president for a time. But it was basically the American version of the Fabian Socialists, and Walter Lippmann was very prominent in that, according to the book Fabian Freeway by Rose Martin. Continuing, when businessmen were hailing it, the NRA, as a new charter of freedom, he was all for it. He began losing his faith in it about the same time that our great business leaders did. When the poor banker and broker hath cried, Lippmann hath wept. He was profoundly distressed at the munitions investigation. He was particularly upset at the grave injustices done Mr. Morgan. He was as much against the War Profits Bill as Charlie Schwab, and as much against the Neutrality Act as the DuPonts. He was against the Utility Holding Company Act, against government interference in business, and has revealed as tender a sensitiveness to the terrible doctrine of soaking the rich as Andy Mellon or Albert Wiggin. Time has made him into as good a Republican as Ogden Mills. After all his wanderings, he is home at last." Unquote. Finally, here are a few hard words from the left. Lippmann had contributed to the old masses. Writes A.B. McGill in the New Masses, quote, "Lippmann once sneered at John Reed. Reed is dead and Lippmann is alive. But in this case, all the life is on the side of the dead. The words of Jack Reed will be meat and drink for the hearts and minds of free men in generations to come, when the name of Walter Lippmann is not even a whisper in the wind." Unquote. And Corliss Lamont writes in the same weekly, quote, "Walter Lippmann constitutes an American tragedy. Starting out as a radical and a socialist, Lippmann ended up by giving over his exceptional gifts to the service of reaction, smirkingly posing as liberalism. And by some strange coincidence, he at the same time attained an eminent position in New York and Long Island society. Parenthesis. This cannot be charged to sour grape snobism coming from the son of Thomas Lamont. End parenthesis. We should not be surprised when young radicals become old or middle-aged Tories, but it is legitimate to feel disappointed." Unquote. But Walter Lippmann is not without new friends. Here, for example, is the accolade given him by the Brooklyn Tablet, the leading pro-Franco publication in this country. It writes editorially, quote, "As Walter Lippmann grows older, his viewpoint becomes wider, and he sees through the half-baked liberals. His articles unmask the shoddy thinking and hypocritical practices of the advanced thinkers of the left. The Tablet, as one of his old critics, is glad to salute him today as a teacher who is performing fine service in ranks where true liberalism seldom gets a hearing." Unquote. The heading over this paragraph in this official organ of, you guessed it, the Catholic Church in Brooklyn is "Lippmann is awake." Wow. That's why this book is so valuable. Documents the vast control over the media that Rome has in this country. And it verifies, in 1938, it verifies all those books that were written by Americans in the late 1800s and earlier. That, hello, people, wake up, Rome's taking over the media, was one of their big warning messages. Dozens of American books, and they're all memory hold now. That was in the 1800s. And look at this, 1938, and here's this reporter who's too socialistic for my liking. Nevertheless, he tells it like it is. He's not afraid to, and he's telling folks over and over in this book that Rome wields more control over the media in the U.S. than any other entity. Continuing. Dorothy Thompson. Mr. Lamont deplores the fact that men, quote, turn tail and seek consolation on the bosom of mother capitalism, unquote. Miss Thompson, like Lippmann who turned tail, was also once a radical. At that time, as she herself explains, she was making a small salary as a hard-working newspaper reporter. Her friends in Berlin and Vienna were all of the left. She knew no reactionaries except professionally, and her sympathies were probably more left than any reporters, except those occasional journalists freelancing amidst poverty for the radical press. Some of the most brilliant arguments for or against the Marxian state, especially as attempted in Soviet Russia, were heard in the little saloon which Miss Thompson conducted in the two capitals, to which she was for years assigned by the Philadelphia Ledger and New York Evening Post. Many of the most famous cultured notables of Vienna and Berlin visited her house, and she was on friendly terms with many more. Freud was one of them. Culture and politics were rivals for her time. Miss Thompson did not then seek consolation on the bosom of mother capitalism, nor did she arrive there by drifting, as did her colleague Mr. Lippmann. She was thrust upon it. In 1927, she began to share the tragedy of Sinclair Lewis. Ever since he became a writer, Red Lewis has considered himself at least liberal, pro-labor, leftist. His ambition has been to write the great labor novel. Ben Stolberg, Ferdinand Reher, in the more distant past, and Professor Ramon Guthrie, only recently, have collaborated with Mr. Lewis in getting the material for what was to be the Lewis masterpiece, and perhaps the greatest achievement in fiction in America. But somehow the book remains unwritten. In the meantime, the Lewis Thompson estate grows. More than a decade ago, in Paris one night, Red had with him a copy of Upton Sinclair's Money Rights. Quote-unquote, "I love Upton," he said, almost weeping. Quote, "Why, I was a janitor for him once, at Helicon Hall, but look what he writes about me. He says I am one of these writers spoiled by money. He says Sinclair Lewis has $1 million. I give you my word, George, I haven't got more than $600,000, and he calls me a millionaire." Unquote. It really doesn't matter if the Lewis Thompson estate today is a $1 million affair or only a $600,000 business, but it is very definitely in the Lippmann class. Dorothy's income from column conducting plus lectures and other writings is estimated at more than $100,000 a year. It is considerably more than the $40 or $50 a week she got when she was a radical in Vienna and Berlin. Miss Thompson has not abandoned every idea of that radical past. What has happened apparent from the alternation of liberal and anti-liberal columns, is an attempt to rationalize the old life and the new. The result at times is utter confusion. Forever, Miss Thompson writes under her slogan, "Let there be light, let reason prevail," apparently unaware that neither light nor reason, parenthesis, with Einsteinian exceptions which do not enter here, end parenthesis, can travel in anything but a straight and narrow line. We have, therefore, a double personality, a schizophrenic case, perhaps, a Jekyll, Hyde, or Miss Thompson and Mrs. Lewis case, in all the literary output, and therefore an output hard to judge. One of the bravest pieces of writing done in America since 1917, when a few intellectuals defied the war mania, was Dorothy's defense of loyalist Spain and defiance of the Catholic hierarchy, which supports the bloodiest movement in the name of Christ the modern world has seen. George Seldes doesn't know that that organization has always had tremendous amounts of blood on its hands and has always hidden behind the name of Christ. What about the Inquisition, George? The centuries-long Inquisitions. Continuing, Miss Thompson denounced the murderous fascist aviators who destroyed Guernica and who killed 10,000 civilians in Barcelona and other loyalist cities. She paid no attention to the Catholic hierarchy's answers on Guernica, as other columnists did, and she was right, because the slaughter at Barcelona, which even bishops and cardinals find hard to defend, was an even worse atrocity. Braver yet is criticism of the Catholic hierarchy at home. We find Miss Thompson, who, time and time again, has attacked the miserable mayor of Jersey City, taunting the Catholic Church with condoning corrupt political machines which its members operate in many cities. Wow. You don't hear about that anymore. She wrote on January 10th, 1938, quote, "I remember also that a number of important Catholics rightly opposed the Supreme Court reorganization scheme because they realized that the Bill of Rights embodied in the Constitution is the greatest bulwark that a minority like the Catholics has against possible persecution. But we don't hear the Catholic hierarchy protesting vigorously against what is happening in Jersey City. On the contrary, the Catholic hierarchy in Jersey City itself is collaborating very closely with Mayor Haig. Or I might find some little community forum in Jersey City whose leader would have the courage to get together a few people, in a church perhaps, and let me come and speak. But then whoever sponsored me would probably have to go through the Inquisition and blackmail which confronted the chairman of the meeting that invited Señor de los Rios to come and speak on Spain. Señor de los Rios is the ambassador of a friendly power in the United States, but the chairman of a meeting that invited him to speak was visited by the Monsignor of Jersey City, who backs up Mayor Haig and queried as to whether he was a communist. And it was made very clear to him that if he backed up the meeting, his business would suffer. I don't think that this is very bright of the Monsignor. He should take a look at Germany, where exactly the same thing is happening to priests of the church that is happening to the CIO organizers in Jersey City, and against which this column has repeatedly protested. Perhaps it is a personal prejudice, but I happen to dislike intensely liberal fascists, reactionary fascists, labor fascists, industrial fascists, Jewish fascists, Catholic fascists, and personal fascists. When it comes to choosing the particular brand of fascism, I'm not taking any. You don't have to choose between them. You can always die first." Unquote. Miss Thompson is willing to die in the fight against fascism, but not willing even to look at the phenomenon everywhere around her. Mr. Lippmann is also willing to give his life for civil liberties, but he sneers at the American Civil Liberties Union, which is working at just the things he is merely writing about. In December 1937, the Liberties Union celebrated its 17th anniversary, and Secretary of the Interior, Harold L. Ickes, himself a seasoned journalist, spoke on nations in nightshirts. The most important paragraphs of this magnificent oration are the following. Quote, "And just as certain nations, uttering the excuse that they are stamping out communism, commit crimes at which savages would blush, so in our own land those who would undermine our democratic institutions do it under the same hollow pretense. Every candidate for office in America who lacks a real issue proceeds to shout communism. Any male or female hysteric, gluttonous for notoriety, and unscrupulous about achieving it, can always uncover a red network. Employers who deny to their workers the right to associate together in a labor union for the common good of all frequently declare that they do so because of communistic influences which are at large in their factories. It does not require much intelligence to see that such communism may become a wooden horse within the bowels of which ruthless fascism may enter the shrine of liberty. As a matter of fact, it is the fascist-minded men of America who are the real enemies of our institutions. They have solidarity, a common interest in seizing more power and greater riches for themselves, and ability and willingness to turn the concentrated wealth of America against the welfare of America. It is these men who, pretending that they would save us from dreadful communism, would superimpose upon America an equally dreadful fascism. Supposedly liberal writers who have droned on quietly for years, while the Tom Girdlers, the Jimmy Rands, and other corporate czars dictated the labor policies of the nation, suddenly become alarmed for human liberty when it is proposed that the state protect the worker who cannot protect himself. We see a Walter Lippmann with the obsequious dignity of a butler, shoving intellectual fodder into the rack for the fascists whom he once despised. Our ancestors fought to prevent a state of censorship of news and ideas. Our ancestors did not fight for the right of a few lords of the press to have almost exclusive control of and censorship over the dissemination of news and ideas. Yet, under the stress of economic forces, our press and news agencies are coming more and more under the domination of a handful of corporate publishers who may print such news as they wish to print and omit such news as they do not wish to print. They may even color the news." Unquote. Mr. Ike's whole speech was reasoned and temperate. There were suggestions that Mayor Haig, the Chicago interests responsible for the Memorial Day massacre, concentrated wealth and special interests are the fascist-minded men of America. In some newspapers, the enormously headlined Manufacturers Association Congress speeches were opposed by that of Ike's. The New York Times and the New York Herald Tribune naturally sneered at the Secretary. But Mr. Lippmann, instead of applauding the true libertarian, attacked him most bitterly. There has been a vast amount of oratory about human liberties, he wrote, quote, but barring some notable exceptions, the orators have been taking no great risks. And then we see Secretary Ike's, honorable veteran of good causes that he is, appearing before the Civil Liberties Union and talking as if he and his partisan associates were the last lone defenders of liberty in America, that to be a critic of what the New Dealers are doing is to be engaged in a conspiracy against the rights of man. There is less excuse for Secretary Ike's than there is for Mayor Haig. Mr. Ike's has known better, and is capable of knowing better, and it is tiresome of him when, adopting the idiotic tactics of a man like Mayor Haig, who calls all his opponents communists, he calls all his opponents fascists. And then there is the National Association of Manufacturers, which has just been in session in New York and has listened to many excellent orations on liberalism and has made many sensible and liberal declarations of its own. That is why the Civil Liberties Union ought to defend a few economic royalists, and why the National Association of Manufacturers ought to defend a few CIO organizers." Unquote. The foregoing column is a fair example of the Lippmann confusion. Ike's does not call all his opponents fascists, only employers who deny their workers human rights, the men of concentrated wealth, the fake liberal writers, the lords of the press who suppress the news, and the very same parallel elements here who bought and paid for the fascist and Nazi movement abroad. So long as one attacks the foreign fascists, Mr. Lippmann recognizes the common enemy and joins in the battle. But it is impossible for him to see the Liga Industriale, or Confederazione dell'Industria, in the NAM, Signor Olivetti in Mr. Girdler, the Confederazione Generale del Lavoro in the CIO, or the Union of German Steel Makers and Fritz Thyssen among his friends in the Union League Club. It is always all right to gore the foreign ox. As for the Civil Liberties Union, it is doing just what Mr. Lippmann suggests, much to the alarm of its old friends. After almost 2 decades of producing proofs that the victims of injustice are always the laboring men and the members of minority groups or followers of minority ideas, the Union has gone to the defense of Nazi organizations, the author of a vicious book attacking liberals, and even economic royalists in rare instances when the law, always used by them to suppress ideas, has turned against them. Columns such as the foregoing are not only confused, they are inaccurate and unfair, and apparently the product of a mind at conflict with itself. And like Mr. Lippmann, Miss Thompson is always on the defensive about her, quote-unquote, liberalism. She regrets the, quote, ridicule by our liberal friends, unquote, in the Supreme Court fight. Addressing the Lotos Club, she said, "We are living in the midst of lost words. Radical, quote, a glorious word originally, unquote, denoting a, quote, man who looks for truth, who wants to get at the root of things, unquote, was one of them, but radicals today are those, quote, who accept with blind obedience a dogma which will not stand the test of any kind of disinterested thinking, unquote. Conservative, quote, a beautiful word, full of meaning and very feminine, unquote. She continued, once denoted those who, quote, hold on to that which is good, unquote, but has now become a shibboleth for those who, quote, believe that the income tax is too high, and that a thing which has been a convention for a long time is inherently good, unquote. Liberal, however, remained the most American and the most humane of all words. As for the speaker, she concluded that she would like to be, quote, a radical as a thinker, a conservative as to program, and a liberal as to temper, unquote. Apparently, the lost words have strayed into a wilderness of thought. Part 2, Chapter 7. And we'll make this the last chapter, and we will conclude the book. There are 2 or 3 more chapters that deal with what would have to happen for a real free press, and that's too pie in the sky for us to deal with here. Part 2, Chapter 7, Treason on the Times. Everywhere but in America, newspapers themselves are news. Publishers are news. Our own journals almost daily report that Rothermere supports Hitler, Beaverbrook warns Parliament, Gaeta threatens loyalist Spain, or Italian press for war, and German press defiant. But with the rare exceptions of a Greeley, a Harding, or a Knox running for office, our great press lords prefer to remain anonymous in their power. That there is a tremendous curiosity about what the American press itself is up to is either overlooked or intentionally ignored by our publishers. Parenthesis. That they suppress or bury all items about their own affairs is an old story. End parenthesis. Many laymen find the press sections in Time and Newsweek the most interesting departments. Many mourn the infrequence of Guy Fawkes's The Wayward Press in the New Yorker, which once took the metropolitan papers for a hebdomadal ride. What in the world does hebdomadal mean? Hebdomadal? Wow. Continuing. And thousands of leading citizens buy the liberal weeklies largely for their inside stories of what the great newspapers are doing or misdoing. Among the rare and usually ephemeral publications produced by newspapermen these days, and devoted entirely to criticizing or exposing our press, there have been the Hearst Worker, the Scripps Howard Beacon, the Brooklyn Eagle Eagle Eye, and the most sensational success of all, the monthly secretly started as Better Times and now published as The New Times. Although the objective of every attack is the New York Times itself, I select this publication for that very reason, because in my opinion, the New York Times is now more so than ever the most important paper in the country, and criticism of it constitutes a criticism of present-day journalism. It also shows what the extreme left thinks of our foremost journal. Volume 1, Number 1 of Better Times appeared in November 1937. It had two mottos: all the news and free the press. It was frankly, quote, published by the Communist Party units of the New York Times, unquote. That fact itself was sensational and disarming. No one could drag a red herring across its trail. It admitted it was itself the red herring. But my investigation shows that about 3/4 of every issue is contributed by non-communists. The sheet was dedicated to the several thousand employees of the paper. In a later issue, a 4-point program was given, number 3 being to, quote, expose false and misleading news in the Times. We believe that the press cannot be free as long as it is privately owned, but despite this we shall try to point out to the Times workers the fact that the Times is far from the impartial medium that it pretends to be. We demand the removal of the fascists Carney and Cortese, unquote. 3 methods are used in the attack. First, the time-honored deadly parallels with Herald Tribune and other Tory headlines compared to the disadvantage of the Times. Second, comparison of Times headlines and news items in the light of later developments which disprove them. And third, the exposure of really secret intramural news. From the first several issues, it would appear that the conservative or Tory press was fairer to the CIO in Michigan troubles than the supposedly liberal pro-New Deal Times. There is also much ado about the family demanding an advance copy of Felix Warburg's obituary, its displeasure, its editing, its demand for a favorable editorial, and its censorships. With the second issue, the note of bitterness enters, the lie direct is passed, and a gossip column appears permitting considerable personal stabbing. The first item, headlined, Red Baiting Times Story Proven Lie, says of a report that, quote, Reds in Union urge new type General Motors war, unquote, that, quote, this story is a complete fabrication and is just one more instance of the Times policy of coloring news when it affects a large advertiser, unquote. The first item in the gossip column, Topics in the Times, mildly relates the fact that night managing editor McCaw wrote managing editor James that the office boys had not been paid their promised extra for election night. Quote, it's things like this that make them join the newspaper guild, unquote. Innocuous as this story appears, it exploded tremendously in the Times editorial office. How could a note from a night to a day editor, handwritten, sealed, personal, become public? The stench of treason rose from the explosion. The Times, from its owners to its office boys, became aware of Better Times. The miniature Winchell of Better Times may not be as brilliant and brittle, but he is more bitter. Every item is destined to hurt. There is no picturesque, Winchell-esque contribution to the American language, but thrusts such as these, quote, "What prominent member of the classified advertising department is greatly interested in the German-American Bund, the Nazi organization?" Unquote. Quote, "When Colonel Adler is in uniform, his chauffeur must give him the regular army salute." Unquote. Quote, "What semi-executive had better stop making passes at the girls in his department if he doesn't want to be reported or arrested? The only reason he hasn't been turned in is because of his wife and baby." Unquote. Quote, "Joe Chaplin now calls Oliver Holden Fink, and Holden calls Chaplin Trotskyite." Unquote. Quote, "Despite the Times editorials favoring a boycott of Japan, the ornaments on the Times Christmas trees were marked Made in Japan." Unquote. Quote, "Speaking of Carney, his cable to Sulzberger to the effect that the other correspondents would not accept him socially because he didn't wear riding boots arouses our sympathy." Unquote. Quote, "When so-and-so was fired for guild activity, his job was given to so-and-so, spy for the 14th floor in the advertising department." Unquote. Quote, "Alexander Kerensky's tour of the United States was sponsored by Simeon Strunsky." Unquote. Quote, "Harold Denny will soon be withdrawing from Moscow." Unquote. Quote, "Olin Downs, music critic, was one of the sponsors of an affair for the benefit of Loyalist Spain recently, but lost his nerve." Unquote. Quote, "Arthur Hayes Sulzberger told George Seldes not long ago that he would like to fire William Carney, General Franco's press agent on the Times payroll, but couldn't do so now for fear of losing face." Unquote. Investigation shows the majority of these items true, but I object to the last item. Mr. Sulzberger did not tell me he would like to fire Carney, and couldn't for fear of losing face. It was simply a gossip column rumor, a distortion, and it brings up the whole question of the reliability of Better Times, because in many respects it is an important publication, since it is the one critic of a great institution which hitherto has held itself above criticism. The cheap and easy trick is to say, as Romans did, falsum in unum, falsum in omnium, and dismiss the magazine entirely. But that, in fact, is the very method the great Times recently employed when it condemned the La Follette Civil Liberties reports, because, in the 2,500 cases of industry employing spies and thugs, there were 8 cases questioned and 1 proven in error. On this error, the Times condemned the 14 volumes of documentary evidence and 2,492 unchallenged cases. A much better way would have been to investigate before editorializing. I have made a fairly thorough investigation of the entire file of Better Times and The New Times. I find, to its credit, that it had a notable scoop on Henry Luce's offer to buy the paper and Mr. Sulzberger's rejection. As for the price, Better Times reported $15 million. And the fact is that $40 million was offered. On the other hand, the story that the Times has invited F.D. Roosevelt to its editorship after 1940 is generally denied. It is true, there is such talk in the air, but no action has been taken. To the credit of Better Times must go the exposure of the war correspondence from Spain, both the publication of false news from Kearny and the continual badgering of Matthews. Better Times may hold the publisher responsible for the situation, but it so happens that the present writer, having been in Spain when the telegrams of censure were sent Matthews, and having placed the evidence before Mr. Sulzberger himself, is convinced that the publisher is in no way guilty, but a serious and reprehensible act has been committed, and its exposure is, in my opinion, the most praiseworthy thing Better Times has done. The facts in the case should be of general interest. It is now well known that reactionary Catholics, parenthesis, as distinguished from liberal Catholics, who are either for the Loyalist government or neutral, end parenthesis, have used their tremendous pressure, plus threats of boycott, and the withdrawal of advertising money, to change the opinion of American newspapers regarding the war in Spain. At the end of this chapter I will tell the story of the Times Madrid correspondent, William P. Kearny, as I learned it in Spain. It is an excellent illustration of many things journalistic, but at the moment the subject is the action Better Times has taken in the Kearny case. At the time of the capture of Teruel by the Loyalists, Kearny reported a week later the recapture by Franco. It is possible that this was an error due to false information, but whereas others merely cabled the falsehood, Kearny gave a description of marches within the recaptured city, rejoicings and celebration. This story cannot be condoned. It is a falsehood. And in addition, Kearny, with the fascists, continually reports events within the Loyalist lines about which he can know nothing, and almost every day injects propaganda into his dispatches. This is exactly what George Orwell wrote about what went on in the Civil War in Spain in the 30s. He was there, and when he got back home, he saw complete fabrication in the papers about what went on in Spain. And in addition, Kearny, with the fascists, continually reports events. He can know nothing, propaganda in his dispatches. On July 11th, he put into the mouths of American prisoners a statement that the American Friends of Spanish Democracy were a propaganda outfit, quote, connected somehow with United States communists, unquote. Both the Reverend Dr. Reisig and Bishop Paddock protested this falsehood, which has been disproven in the Times itself months ago. But the Times permitted Kearny to repeat it, and without investigation wrote an editorial upholding Kearny. The exposure of such practices by Better Times and the New Times therefore deserves a medal for journalistic service. Not since the famous New Republic exposure of the falsity of the Russian news from 1917 to 1920 has there been such a valid criticism of the Times. As for Matthews, he was decorated by Mussolini for his war correspondence in Ethiopia. He then said, and still believes, that the Italian troops were excellent there, and the invasion probably for the best. He was friendly to Italy when he came to Spain. He has, of course, realized the rightness and nobility of the Loyalist side, but from the very beginning he has been held in check by the Times editors, whereas Kearny has had a free hand. Better Times tells the story of how the cable and managing editors have insulted and intimidated Matthews. When I asked Mr. Sulzberger about it, he told me he has never heard of such actions, and I believe him. But I know that Better Times is absolutely right in its charge. and I have not had the facts from Matthews. The mystery is easily explained when the telegrams from New York saying, "Stop sending propaganda," and "Why do you say there were Italians at Guadalajara?" when Carney denies it, and similar cables arrived in Madrid, Ilse Kolzar, the censor, showed them around. Better Times states on January 1938, page 3, column 1, that, quote, "The fascist phalanx in the bullpen," unquote, is pro-Franco, anti-Matthews, pro-Carney. One of this group is responsible for the change between the first and city editions of the headline on Father Duffy's address, "Priest defends fascist nations," to "Priest sees Soviet real foe of U.S." This is a typical case of slanting Times headlines until they become Hearstian in their red-baiting. Night managing editor Raymond McCaw is accused by Better Times of being responsible for the order to substitute, quote-unquote, insurgent troops, wherever Matthews wrote, quote-unquote, Italian troops. This also parallels Hearst's order to change the Associated Press and UP cables, using, quote-unquote, Reds for, quote-unquote, loyalists, proof of which I have in letters from these agencies. Continues Better Times, quote, "In vain the copy reader protested the whole point of the story was Matthews' proofs of military intervention by Mussolini. So he carried out his orders with malicious glee when he came to a line declaring these troops were Italian and nothing but Italians," unquote. Does the reader remember, perhaps, his confusion over the Matthews story, which concluded, quote, "These troops were insurgents and nothing but insurgents," unquote? Better Times further charges the assistant editors with sending a pro-fascist to head the copy desk for a while, and describes his discomfiture and transfer, and also sees a plot in the orders which prevented Matthews' vacation coinciding with Sulzberger's trip to Europe. But its full bitterness was apparent in its February issue when Better Times, reporting the publisher's speech at Chapel Hill, added, quote, "Mr. Sulzberger is quoted as saying of the Spanish War, 'I confess to a vast sense of relief that I do not have to take sides with either loyalist or rebel. He is glad he is not compelled to choose between right and wrong,' unquote. Such an editorial opinion is hard to understand. If the communist unit knows what is really happening at the Times, and it gives factual evidence, it knows a lot, it should also understand that Arthur Hayes Sulzberger is a convinced neutral liberal, and his intentions are honest, and that he is woefully ignorant of the Carney situation and of many things that happen in his office. It is true that if the sabotage, intimidation, distortion, coloration, and suppression that happens on the Times was directed to advance any progressive or leftist cause, instead of a reactionary or pro-Franco or generally rightist cause, the editors, sub-editors, reporters, and others engaged in it would immediately find themselves out of a job. But being reactionaries, they are not only in, but going up. I think this is the most important factor about the Times at present. Mr. Sulzberger says he is a liberal. There is no reason to doubt that he himself believes his liberalism a fact. Mr. Sulzberger's idea of liberalism is to permit men of all opinions to occupy his editorial jobs, even when a majority of them are not only non-liberals but anti-liberals and ultimately enemies of liberalism. He seems incapable of spotting reactionary sabotage but smells, quote-unquote, radical disloyalty far away. In the March-April issue, The New Times, as it was now called, under the headlines, Civil Liberties Probes Sabotaged as News, said that, quote, the Times sabotaged news of the La Follette Civil Liberties Committee's investigation of the National Association of Manufacturers in the first part of March so completely that it ought to get paid with more advertising for publishing only what the manufacturers think is fit to print, unquote. I was shocked by this statement because I thought it false. I took the statement to one of the chiefs of the La Follette Committee, one of my best friends. His reply was general. Practically the entire American press sabotaged or suppressed the hearings of the Manufacturers Association. So long as the La Follette Committee dealt with strikes and strikebreakers, its hearings were reported. But when the House of Lords of Big Business was investigated, the press, including the Times, purposely threw the story down. On several occasions, the labor-hating Sun gave more NAM investigation news than the supposedly impartial Times. In the May-June issue, the Times is accused of changing to an anti-New Deal policy, and proofs are advanced. A large part of the issue is taken up with an editorial, Lenin and Jefferson. There is the usual mixture of fact with bitterness and propaganda, but this issue, as all the rest, is intensely interesting. On publication day, the Times office loses its Olympian dignity. Laughter, shouts, and a deep curse from the fascist phalanx mark the appearance of the New Times. Everyone marvels at the disclosures. Managing editor James sends a boy into the street to get 2 copies. He frequently accuses a reporter of being one of the quote-unquote disloyal who produced the sheet. To one who proved his innocence, he remarked, "Why, those blank Reds are even in Sulzberger's office," unquote. This is from Better Times in January. The secret sheet accuses the Times of sending detectives to its printing shop, intimidating its quote-unquote newsboys, and trying to put it out of business. So far as I can tell, there is nothing illegal and nothing libelous in the New Times. There are propaganda editorials which do not interest me. There are a few mistakes. There is also evidence of intense enmity against Sulzberger and the Times itself, and while this is interesting as a social phenomenon, in a world where employers still wave the old falsehood about the interests of capital and labor being identical, it is not the one significant fact. The significant fact, which is implicit, although the New Times might give monthly emphasis to it, is that the newspaper, admittedly the most important in America, and popularly believed the best among metropolitan publications, is far from being a free newspaper. Its claims to liberalism cannot be mentioned in real liberal circles. Its motto, "All the news that's fit to print," has been challenged too often. The evidence is provided in every issue of the New Times that the great canons of journalism, independence, truthfulness, impartiality, fair play, do not always thunder on the American thunderer. In fact, some of them barely whisper, and at times all are silent. The Little Times tries to make a personal devil out of the publisher. I do not think this is quite fair, but I do think that Mr. Sulzberger must realize that no matter how much he prefers to remain in the neutral background, his paper continues to push into the front line of active social political forces, The Times itself is news. It might therefore be better policy for Mr. Sulzberger to make a living force out of his announced liberalism than to let that credo become a football for some elevated police reporters who have become editorial powers and who speak of Sulzberger liberalism as, quote-unquote, the bunk. Mr. Sulzberger should not forget that his paper is so powerful that hundreds of others take their tips from it. The Times not only influences its million readers, but many more millions through newspapers which follow its policies. The New York Times today is approaching the London Times as a national institution. The truer this statement becomes, the more pessimistic must be our judgment of American journalism, because the Times proves every month that in the greatest of our papers there is also a slanting of news, an exaggeration of headlines, bias in politics, worse than bias in labor reporting, burial alive of quote-unquote bad news, subservience to big business, if not to individual advertisers, and the usual bowing down in the House of Rimmon, where the ancient golden calf has become the sacred cow of American journalism. What this little communist gadfly of a paper has proven is that even our most important and best respected newspaper is far from being free. How deplorable, then, must be that journalism of the majority of the press, which has not a fraction of the integrity and freedom from venality which the Times rightly claims. Journalistically, the voice of the New Times is but a whisper, but figuratively it is a national hookup roaring out an indictment of the whole press of America. And the unanswerable point of the indictment is that our whole press, the greatest power in shaping public opinion, is not playing a fair game with the American people. The case of General Kearney. The case of William P. Kearney of the New York Times deserves special attention because it illustrates the power a reporter can have if his views are backed by a pressure group such as the Legion, any church, the NAM, or other seekers of special privilege. When General Franco marched on Madrid in November 1936, his associate, the drunken buffoon General Queipo de Llano, speaking over the Seville radio, betrayed one of the many fascist conspiracies. He announced that Franco was marching with 4 columns and was relying on, quote-unquote, the 5th column, the secret fascist conspirators living in Madrid and pretending to be loyal, to stab the Republic in the back. This announcement resulted in the government taking appropriate action. The prisons of Madrid and Valencia are full of traitors, at least all the known ones except the thousands who were able to buy their way into South American pro-fascist embassies and the headquarters of European ministers favorable to the reactionaries and the minds and money they controlled. But no announcement has been made from General Franco in Burgos on the support his treasonable cause has had from his 6th column, the columns commanded by, quote-unquote, General Kearney in the New York Times. This support of fascism did not begin in July 1936, when Franco, after conspiring with Italian fascist and German Nazi authorities and arranging for the guns and airplanes now in use, openly began the landowners and mine owners' rebellion. This support from William P. Kearney, the New York Times correspondent in Madrid, began in the early days of the Spanish Republic. It was intensified in 1936. It became fanatical when the fascist columns were stopped. Carney was the friend of Robles and LaRue, who formed the clerico-fascist government of 1933, and which in 1934 imported Moors and the Tercio to massacre the Asturian miners. Carney, throughout this period, wrote in support of this pre-fascist movement. The Times refused to listen to protests from all liberals, including a lengthy one from Madariaga. When Franco rebelled and the government put on a censorship, Carney, according to government officials, attempted on all occasions to write into his cables to America items to aid and comfort fascism and to betray government positions and army plans to Franco. The censors in Madrid make the statement that from almost every cable which Carney sent to the Times, they had to delete military information, which he injected despite daily warnings. In public cafes and in gatherings of journalists and others, Carney, throughout the months of July to December 1936, continued to express his allegiance to the fascist cause. He openly supported Franco. He cursed the liberal Republican government, and he called them Reds. On leaving Spain in December 1936, Carney wrote a very long cable in which he pretended to tell the uncensored truth. The Paris office of the Times informs me that the entire staff would have nothing to do with this cable, because, although it did not know what was the truth, it realized that Carney's was not, because his lies and prejudices were too apparent. Also, and this is most important, one American of the Times Paris staff did realize that Carney's cable contained a list of the artillery batteries of Madrid and their disposition. However, the Times Bureau informs me it was not able to cancel the cablegram of another Times man. It merely washed its hands of the matter, and therefore Carney filed the 10,000 words himself. In the government press bureaus in Madrid and Valencia, the truth of a large part of the Carney cable is denied. From my own experience in Spain, I can say that parts of it are evidently ridiculous and all of it prejudiced. One of the most vicious of all the General Carney's statements is also contained in this dispatch. Quote, "Madrid cannot be considered an open city," unquote, says, quote-unquote, General Carney. Quote, "Madrid is an open city," unquote, states General Franco. When, where, and how did Franco come to make this statement? You will find it in the New York Times of March 16, 1937, in a dispatch signed by Carney. In other words, Franco is more honest than Carney. Carney, apologizing for fascism, attempted to defend the murder of innocent people in Madrid by telling the Times readers that he did not consider Madrid an open city, whereas the man who ordered the murdering calmly admits that Madrid is an open city. Carney, professional red-baiter, then repeats the biggest myth of the Spanish War. He cabled, quote, "There were foreign volunteers, the International Column, as they were termed, comprising the 10th, 11th, and 12th Battalions. They were mostly Russians," unquote. This statement is a lie. Parenthesis. Why call it a misstatement or a falsehood when the word lie is the right one? End parenthesis. All the correspondents in Spain then and now know that there never were and are not now any Russians in the International Brigade. They know there are no Russian troops in Spain. They know that there are or were once, some Russians in the Spanish Aviation and Tank Corps, Russian engineers and experts. Some estimate the number at 500, others at 700, but no Russian troops have ever been sent to Spain, and to call the 10th, 11th, and 12th battalions of the International Brigade, quote-unquote, mostly Russians, is to utter a lie. But the most vicious part of the cable is the description of the defenses of Madrid. Carney tells of machine guns and anti-aircraft guns, quote, mounted on the tops of all the ministries and tall buildings in the center of the city, such as the Fine Arts structure, Calle Alcalá, Madrid's main street, and the Palace of the Press in the Gran Via, or Broadway. Batteries of 6-inch guns have been placed in the Callao Square, directly in front of the park, near the Prado Museum, the Observatory, and the Ministry of Public Works, the Atocha and Andalusian railway station, where more batteries were placed. Observation posts for the government's artillery are stationed in the towers of the taller buildings in the center of the city, unquote. As a war correspondent, I know that if I had sent such a dispatch from the American Expeditionary Force, I would have been taken out and shot. Moreover, there was in Spain at the time a United States government officer. I cannot identify him further, because pressures might be brought against him by the pro-fascists in America, who said to me, quote, the man who sent that list of gun emplacements should be shot. If he were on Franco's side and sent such a cable, he should be shot. I make this statement without any emotion and without any prejudices. In any war, and no matter what side you are on, a war correspondent sending out a list of gun emplacements is committing an act of espionage, and shooting is too good for him. Professional spies do such things and take the risk of being shot. But the correspondent of a big and powerful newspaper is not only committing an act of espionage, he is hiding behind the power of his newspaper, unquote. Carney also defended the slaughter of the women and children of Madrid. Quote, it cannot be helped that women and children and aged persons have taken refuge in the basements of these structures, say the insurgents, unquote. He cabled, not only trying to excuse the murders, but actually reporting from Madrid what the fascists on the other side were saying. An unheard-of feat in journalism, but an old trick in propaganda. Continues Mr. Carney, quote, dispatches submitted for censorship had to be accompanied by Spanish translations, unquote. Quote, this is an absolute lie, unquote, says Ilse Kolsar, the censor to whom Mr. Carney submitted his dispatches. After Carney's vacation in Paris in December 1936, he was sent to the fascist side, and this seems to me one of the most reprehensible actions in modern journalism. To the dismay of the entire Anglo-American press corps in Valencia and Madrid, including the numerous New York Times representatives, a new series of Carney dispatches, dated Gibraltar, began appearing in the Times. Carney had joined Franco's side. On February 25th, he began quoting the exaggerations and the murderous boasts of the Quiepo de Llano. From Franco's side, he was also able to tell what the government side was doing. He reported from Motril that, quote, retreating government troops are reported to have burned the few remaining churches and to have executed 200 persons, including 4 priests who were burned alive after a gasoline bath, unquote. The authenticated reports from this front, confirmed by other reporters with Franco, is that the government did not even harm the fascists in the prisons. The Carney Report is another of the thousands of hearsay atrocities. That's what George Orwell said. I can state on the authority of 6 New York Times correspondents in Europe that each one is disgusted with the sort of journalism which Carney has produced. Without exception, these reputable journalists declare Carney should have remained with Hearst. All right, there. Like I said, there's 2 or 3 more chapters. We're not going to get into them. They are, again, speaking about what would have to happen to have a truly free and unbiased press in the nation. And, of course, that's never hasn't happened since then. It's never going to happen. Never has happened. So, we're going to skip those chapters. This has been, folks, you've listened now. If you've listened to all of these, you've listened to the entirety of this memory hold classic from 1938, Lords of the Press, by George Seldes. This has been Rejected Knowledge. But votes against the newspapers in general. Quote, Election Day, 1936, was Judgment Day for America's daily press. Unquote. Unfair, partial apologists for the publishers have listed the papers in the solid South, with their millions of readers, without explaining that no opposition press existed there and no contest. On the other hand, the anti-press case would be made much worse by testing the specific gravity of the papers officially listed as pro-Roosevelt. In New York City, for instance, the Post, the World Telegram, the Times, and the News, with more than 2.5 million circulation, are listed as supporting Roosevelt, against 2.25 million for Landon in the Hearst Press, the Herald Tribune, and the Sun. A rather fair setup, but one must not rest on figures. One must attempt to measure emotions. The passion which Hearst put into his pro-Landon campaign was a combination of all the yellowness which has made him notorious for half a century and earned him the boycott of most decent and intelligent people in America at long last. As Dr. Beard recently pointed out, there was no cesspool which Mr. Hearst has not searched, no art of character assassination which he has not practiced. And so, stories were invented, headlines were colored, news was puffed up or suppressed, and everything possible done to smear and destroy the reformer in the White House. The Sun refrained from yellowness. It ran no gargantuan headlines, invented no pure fakes, kept out of cesspools, but it showed that in a nice, gentlemanly, well-bred, upper-class and aristocratic manner, it was able to join hands with Hearst in coloring and distorting and smearing. If Hearst journalism reeked of the sewer, the Sun's smelled of a royal charnel house. The Herald Tribune gave its usually biased Republican news. All in all, the pro-Landon press was strong in its support and extremely active in its propagandizing of the electorate. The 2,296,050 circulation of the 4 papers was thoroughly exploited by partisan news and editorials, with little attempt made at objectivity except in the Herald Tribune. But the same cannot be said for the pro-Roosevelt press. The Times published one editorial announcing itself for the president, and then continued its policy of presenting the news impartially as between Roosevelt and Landon. Its editorials were never alarming or decisive. Its editorial policy did not affect the news. The World Telegram supported Roosevelt, but it was not with any magnificent enthusiasm. Its support was not very strong. It did not color the news, suppress or distort, or indulge in the usual tricks of the rival pro-Landon press. The news was strongly pro-Roosevelt. This support was important. But the news was broad-minded enough to inaugurate a quote-unquote battle page in which the Republican and Democratic parties would tell their stories, deride the claims of rivals, put over the worst sort of propaganda. The Republicans made great use of this page in the Democratic news. The Post was 100% for Roosevelt. If, therefore, an attempt is made to gauge the quality as well as the quantity of circulation, it will be found that the Landon support was actually more intense than the cold figures indicate, and that a considerable proportion of the Roosevelt figures cannot be rightly placed in his column. In other words, the 71% pro-Landon circulation in what the New Republic called the 15 competitive areas, where both candidates had a chance of winning, is actually opposed by less than the 29% pro-Roosevelt circulation of the statistics. Curiously enough, in 4 large cities where the president had not one newspaper on his side, he won by about 2-1. In Chicago, where the circulation was almost 10-1 for Landon, and that favorite son Knox, the voting was just under 2-1 for the quote-unquote outside agitator. Apologists for the press are still interpreting the 1936 figures in an attempt to restore prestige out of debris. But even they admit that the majority of the papers, the circulation, the editorials, and the bias were on Landon's side, and that Landon was defeated by just about an inverse ratio. Columns of strength. The President himself has made the distinction between the Washington correspondents and the Washington columnists. Quote, "I consider it an interesting fact," unquote, wrote Franklin D. Roosevelt in the introduction of his state papers. Quote, "that in spite of this array of editorial opposition, which apparently has been unable to exercise adequate influence upon public opinion in the United States, the majority of newspaper correspondents who cover the White House are personally friendly to the administration, and in general approve its objectives, most of its methods, and the legislation adopted to accomplish its goal. I know that a number of the newspaper correspondents who write so-called unfriendly articles are not personally opposed to the things they write about." The Washington correspondents voted 19-1 for Roosevelt. In the Chicago Tribune, New York Herald Tribune, and other towers of Landonism, the vote among the working reporters was about the same ratio. When politics cooled in 1937, the editorial board of the New Republic prepared a study of the press and the public, which said that among the debris scattered across 48 states on the morning of November 5th, 1936, quote, were the microphone of Father Coughlin, the silk hats of the Liberty League, the high stiff collar of Dr. Townsend, and, like the accumulation of wreckage left by the recession of every flood, the power of the press. Some of the country's foremost columnists were included in the repudiation of the press, unquote. The general press repudiation. The circulation figures, the number of newspapers, and other statistical tests of the repudiation of 1936 do not tell the whole story. Editor and publisher, for example, tries to make out a case for its friends the membership of the ANPA from the fact that 1935 circulation figures were used by the liberal journals in estimating the readership of 1936. I do not think it necessary to quibble. The fact is that if the press was not 9-1 against Roosevelt, it was 7-3 or 6-4 against him, and that in 1938 this percentage increased still more. And the reason, as Captain Patterson of the New York Daily News so bluntly said, had more to do with pocketbooks than principles. The fair, impartial Christian Century, without using statistics, said that thousands, probably millions, of the ballots cast in the 1936 elections were not merely for Roosevelt. Okay, so we're on to Chapter 5 of Part 2 of Lords of the Press by George Seldes from 1938. And this is going to be our last installment. There is one more short section after this, a Part 3, in which the author, George Seldes, outlines what it would take, the kinds of things that would have to happen in order for the nation to have a truly free and objective press. But those things have never happened. They're never going to happen, so I'm not going to concern ourselves with false hopes here. Okay, so this is going to be the last installment, Chapter 5 of Part 2, 1936 and the Columnists. 1936 is one of the great dates in our political history because it is also a social and economic date. Its significance will undoubtedly grow. Journalistically, it marked the most important repudiation of the press by the public. How important that repudiation was, only time can tell, but it was certainly the first time in our history that a large number of people became aware of the newspaper as a political force, a fact which even the humble European peasant has known for at least a century. 1936 also showed up the place of that new power in American journalism, the columnist. The Washington correspondents, those several hundred men who write the politics of the nation, were overwhelmingly on the side of Roosevelt and reform, although overwhelmingly their papers were opposed. Most of the columnists, however, had no compromise to face, no conscience to trouble them. They, as well as big business, the millionaire oil man of Kansas, Hearst, the Manufacturers Association, the Liberty League, were all on the same side.